Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. My name is Keith Pascal. Today we're continuing our series about the UCMDB to UCMDB integration. Let's talk about some troubleshooting. First, when you're troubleshooting UCMDB to UCMDB integration, it's imperative that you know the version that you're pushing from and the version that you're pushing to. Is the issue in the push engine on the source, in the results or status on the target? You can get the adapter XML files and also examine identification rules for CIs. Look at the TQLs that you're using. Again, I cannot stress this enough in this class. Writing good TQLs makes integrations much easier. You can use the JMX retrieve TQL results to actually calculate the results of a given TQL. On the source, you can put the FCMDB synchronizer into debug. Some debugging from the FCMDB synchronizer only takes effect with trace level debugging. On the source probe, put the FCMDB logs into debug, and then on the target, put reconciliation into debug. To put the FCMDB synchronizer into debug, this is for federated CMDB. So if you are federating CIs from one system to another, also though, if you were pushing CIs from one system to another. In the log for j2_root.yaml file in the conf log directory of UCMDB, find the fcmdb.log level and change the value to debug or to trace. When we're looking at this in debug, you will see locks acquired for jobs and TQLs. Then you'll see the sync unit calculation. On debug, we'll show the IDs that we are pushing. Check the last state and new state and the differences between them, also in debug. Then we will do an ID mapping replacement to replace the CMDB IDs with some kind of a mapping. For example, UCMDB CI type, like node, and then an internal ID equals a string that is the global ID. Now, all of the equal signs are replaced with things like %3D. There's a %0As in there. There'll also be in there a customer ID. We also are going to get indivisible CIs. That are CIs that should never be pushed by themselves. We'll add those to the sync unit and then send it to the probe for pushing. There are a couple of database tables that you can also take a look at. The sync_data store, that shows the IDs of each integration point. That's each data store for storing those IDs that we're using. For example, DS ID of 1003, the customer ID is 1. The data store is called push single node. Push single node is the actual name of the integration point. The DSID will also be in another table called sync ID map _ and then the number of the DSID, DS data store ID, right? 1003. In there, we will store the mappings. So if I run, for example, select star from sync ID map _ 1003, it will show me the source and target IDs for each item being pushed, right? There are columns there. For example, the source ID, which is the global ID from the source, the target ID, the CMDB ID from the target, and is it a relationship, and the source external ID. That's a long ID that we mapped earlier in the file. For example, the one below, UCMDB %0A. %0A is an HTML replacement string, I believe for a new line. Then PostgreSQL, that's the CI type. %0A 1, %0A, right? That is the customer ID. Internal _ID %3D. %3D is an equal sign. Equals string %3D equals, and then the actual global ID, and then %0A being a new line. That is the ID mapping. And you can see these long IDs, for example, in some of the reconciliation logs. It is sometimes helpful to do a search of the sync ID map to actually determine what the source ID is for that particular CI, although it should be the same as this ID here, which is the global ID. Here is an example of the sync state context table. That shows all the jobs with the integration point names, right? So in this case, I have sync query IDs. These are each individual queries. Push complete single node with infrastructure, single node with running software. It's all contained in a single job, which is all contained in a single integration in my case, with a customer ID of 1. You can use SQL to check reconciliation errors. For example, the top line here is a reconciliation log error where I had not enough reconciliation information need to supply, and then it has the entire rule error adding or updating on level 1, and then it has the object itself, right? So you can take this temp ID string, and then you can search for it without the temp object part in the front in the sync ID map table. So select star from sync ID map _1003, where source external ID equals, and then this whole everything from UCMDB to the end of this %0A, right? So once again, it would be UCMDB node 1, an internal ID string, and the actual global ID. You can do a search in that table to see that. You can also take the same error and look for it in IT Universe, right? Take that temp ID, search for it without the temp object ID to find the global ID, make sure that CI is in the initial node push. In this case, it was not, all right? And what I mean is, remember, we split our queries up into a single node push and then a node with running software and a node with infrastructure. If I had nodes in the second 2 queries that were not in the first query, then I no longer have that global ID on the target, and that's all I'm sending, remember, is the global ID. So then you would have to modify your TQL to make sure that the nodes that are being pushed in the subsequent queries were pushed in the initial query. On the probe, you can put FCMDB into debug in the dataflow probe installation directory /conf/log/fcmdb.properties. Set the line that is log level equals info to log level equals debug. And then in the log file, there's going to be an fcmdb.adapters.adaptername.log. The adapter name is the actual name of the integration point. This will include the IDs that are being pushed and the IDs we get back from the external system to store in the sync map table. The most important methods from the JMX: remove ID mappings of data store, where the data store is the actual name of the integration point and it matches the sync_data store name in the database. You would need to do that if, for example, you modify the TQL. Then we need to remove the ID mappings of the data store so that the data that we're pushing is a known set of data. So if the TQL is modified, we need to remove this. If we modified the integration point significantly, added additional queries, or it had been disabled and re-enabled at some later point in time, it's always a good idea to remove the ID mappings of the data store. Retrieve TQL result will show the results of the TQL as seen by UCMDB. And then calculate TQL ad hoc does the same thing as retrieve TQL result for a given pattern, for a given query. In all cases, use the TQL name that we find in the sync state context table, which lists all of the TQLs and the jobs for the integration points. Happy troubleshooting. I hope you have a great day, and thank you.